A triple murder in a small Berkshire village.
The question that people and police officers are asking themselves, can it happen again?
A 4-decade quest for justice.
We exhausted virtually every avenue that was possible in the investigation world.
And a killer who was closer to the community than anyone could have imagined.
We hadn't had a murder in our village in living memory.
This murder town is Beam.
Killers are unpredictable. They can attack anyone at any time. Their motives are often varied, and chillingly, in a number of cases, their reason to kill is completely unknown. Some can be organised and planned with meticulous efficiency, whilst others are more opportunistic. They live amongst us in our towns and cities, and one thing sets them apart from the rest of society: their terrifying capacity to kill. Welcome to Murdertown.
Do you feel it in the air? Everything is changing, a world wasted by fear. Something wicked this way comes, something wicked this way comes. It's been around since time began, a million times around our sun. Something wicked this way comes, something wicked this way comes.
Some murders are solved in a matter of days, while others can take weeks, months, or even years.
In 1966, this quiet village in Berkshire was the scene of a shocking and unexplained homicide, followed just 6 months later by the brutal murder of 2 young girls. All 3 cases unsolved.
It would take 46 years and the dedicated work of the Thames Valley Police Major Crime Review Team to finally bring a killer to justice.
What this team were dedicated to do was to review and, if necessary, reinvestigate undetected homicides, but also serious crimes. One of the worries is that you wake a sleeping monster, and that's the best way I can describe it. You uncover something which is so significant and of such magnitude, you're compelled to progress the investigation, but at the same time, you might risk the possibility that the public may ask questions as to why this perhaps wasn't uncovered many years ago. What I would say is this: nothing is going to outweigh the true benefit of actually bringing someone to justice for a crime that they thought they got away with. And actually we owe that to victims, and we owe that to surviving family victims. There's a real balance to be drawn here, but actually what you cannot do is stop just because you might well wake up that monster.
One such crime occurred here in Beam, a village in Berkshire sandwiched in between the towns of Reading and Newbury. This small community now has a population of just over 1,000 people.
With just 5 square miles of rolling farmland, the village has one pub, a small school and an industrial estate that encourages the community to thrive. It has been declared an area of outstanding natural beauty.
Beam is a nice little village in Berkshire. At the time, occupancy of about 500.
Beam was a small, tight-knit community. Some people thought it was isolated because You had a mile to walk to reach the A4, and you had more or less the same tedious walk to get to Bucklebury Avenue. And those were the only places where you could pick up buses. No buses ever ran through Beanham. It was a lovely little village, peaceful, quiet, and the children were so well behaved. It was just a pleasure to be there. People did know each other in those days, but of course, it's all changed now. With the new estates, affordable housing for youngsters, a new school. Nobody knows everybody now. Nobody knows everybody now.
On the 30th of October 1966, though, this quiet, remote location was the scene of a gruesome discovery.
Some farm workers found some clothing, which they thought was a bit bizarre. They were moving some hay about. There was blood on it. The farm workers raised it with the farmer, who called the police. And there was then a search of the area.
When they called up and said that they'd found a body, we all went to the scene. That was where we discovered that the body was in a ditch. You wouldn't even know it was there if you walked up the road. It was entangled with the bushes.
The body, discovered by two people, was 17-year-old Yolande Waddington. She lived in the village and had recently begun working as a live-in nanny.
She appeared to have been stabbed twice in the torso.
Once the body was found and Yolande was located, the scene was preserved. She'd been attacked by a knife. A knife was located nearby as well, along with the clothing, and it was thought that that knife actually had committed the wounds. And what was really interesting was there was a plastic fertilizer bag, and that was also found nearby, again with blood splattering on it. So Yolande was discovered and she'd been restricted and she had been strangled.
I never met her, so I never spoke to her. I don't think she met very many people from the village. She'd been there such a short time. And she was an outsider as well. She came from town. She was a childminder at this farm, which was in quite a lonely place. And she wasn't there very long.
She was there on a capacity where she was given board as well as employment.
We hadn't had a murder in our village in living memory, so it was a shock. It did leave people a little nervous, but they were still thinking, because she was a newcomer, wasn't anything or anybody in the village who would have anything to do with it. It would be an outside affair.
Yolande Waddington was last seen here at the Six Bells pub at around 10:35 p.m. when she came to buy cigarettes. The question of what happened to her after that wouldn't be answered for over 4 decades. And in that time, this tiny community would be rocked by 2 more murders.
Fear hangs over the village of Beanham and the countryside around. Could last night's double child murder have been connected with the 5-month-old murder of Yolande Waddington about 3.5 miles away? And can it happen again?
On the 30th of October 1966, the body of 17-year-old Yolande Waddington was discovered in a waterlogged ditch by a farm labourer and Yolande's employer.
Her hands were bound, and she'd been strangled and stabbed twice, with the cause of death later established as asphyxia through strangulation.
A large-scale murder investigation was launched by Berkshire Constabulary, assisted by the Metropolitan Police Service.
That was knocking on the doors and going to every place that was lived in at all, you know. Do you know anybody else that used to come up here frequently and this sort of thing? It was every possible one we could possibly get a blood sample from.
They questioned everybody. In fact, they came and grilled my husband and I. We were in separate rooms. I think it was because we were farming. Yolande had been murdered within walking distance of the farm she was working for, and I think people were beginning to connect.
There was over 3,000 statements. There was just under 200 exhibits. So there was really a wealth of stuff to work on.
One of the key pieces of evidence the police were able to identify were traces of blood on Yolande's clothing. The blood group was different to her own, so if they could match that sample to someone in the village, they might be able to find Yolande's killer.
There was blood found at the scene. The investigation team at the time felt the only way to try and identify the killer of poor Yolande was to try and get everybody in the village, every male in the village from 16 to 50 or 60 years of age. And it had to be male because of the type of blood that was found. The idea to do a mass blood screening, I think, was a very brave step to take. There was a view, because of the location, because of the area, it was a rural setting, that it was potentially somebody within the village or local who committed that horrendous crime. Every male was potentially a suspect.
I think they all cooperated. I don't think there was anybody that said, you know, we're not giving one or anything else. Not aware of anybody that objected. You know, it was a good idea, really. It probably started people wondering on the thing, are they going to come to me next?
The blood grouping at that time was able to be identified. They were able to pin that down into smaller numbers, but what they were not able to do was to categorically say that that blood matched an individual. A suspect was clearly identified right from the outset, but of course an alibi was presented, and because of the blood grouping situation, yes, he matched, but so did others. So we were left with a situation at the time that although he was a good suspect, there was just not enough actually to take action and prosecute him at the time.
This was one of the first voluntary mass blood tests conducted in UK criminal history. Unfortunately, it failed to yield a match to the blood found on Yolande's clothing. With no prime suspect identified, this threw doubt on the theory that 17-year-old Yolande Waddington's killer could be local. Not only that, but the question was asked as to whether that killer would strike again.
Scotland Yard and Wally Virgo at the time made it very clear at a public meeting that his view was that this killer, because of how poor Yolande was murdered, would strike again. There was no doubt in his mind that that was the view. That, sadly, came true.
Just 6 months later, on the 17th of April 1967, with the killer still at large, 2 9-year-old schoolgirls went missing in this small, peaceful village.
on the same day they were reported missing. I think by both parents, really, because they're inseparable, these two. They played together, they schooled together, they did everything together.
The fact that they both went missing, it was virtually instantly. I think got a search party up and we started. It was fairly obvious that something had happened.
This was more important to the village people. 2 of their little girls had gone missing. And I mean, it was round the village in no time at all.
I was there on the search party. We had sort of about 30 or 40 police officers there, and we were all issued with whistles and also segregated so that it was a methodical search, and with the instructions, after you find anything, blow the whistle. After the search was going for about half an hour, 3 hours, the whistle went, and that was when the discovery was made of the 2 girls in the pond.
The bodies of Janette Wigmore and Jacqueline Williams were found in this area that used to be a gravel works on the evening of the 17th of April, 1967.
Janette was found by her father at around 8:30 p.m, and Jacqueline was discovered about 100 yards away from where her friend lay at 10:45 p.m.
Janette had been stabbed and Jacqueline had been strangled.
Fear hangs over the village of Beam and the countryside around. The question that people and police officers investigating last night's double child murder are asking themselves: could last night's killing have been connected with the 5-month-old murder of Yolande Waddington about 3.5 miles away? And can it happen again?
People rang me to tell me the awful news because I was their teacher, and on the Monday morning there were 2 empty chairs. It was just dreadful. Anything Janette and Jacqueline were doing, I know their parents knew. In fact, one of them had a little sister who also had a bicycle, and she asked, could she go with them? And sort of they haughtily said, no, you're too young, you'll be a responsibility. And thank goodness she didn't go. They were delightful girls. Oh, they were hard-working, they were helpful, and they were popular with everybody in the class. They were kind. I never heard them speak a spiteful word to anybody. An innocent calm about both of them. And they were both very trusting girls. They were just lovely to teach, yes.
There's quite a bit of evidence at the scene. You know, sometimes when you come across a crime scene, there's a very clear attempt to sort of discard or hide evidence. And there wasn't here. There was blood, there was clothing which was also covered in blood. So there was no real attempt to disguise the evidence that was presented when they were found.
Well, I think everybody's just gone numb, you know. It just doesn't seem to sink in, really. It's such a horrible feeling.
Have you been able to tell your children what's happened?
Oh, they know what's going on because, I mean, they're old enough to realise.
The Beam people were really shocked and really very nervous that this had happened. And I know that the parents began coming down in hordes to pick up their children, whereas before they could trust them to dawdle home with their friends. It was so safe. But it was no longer, and it frightened people. It really, now, it frightened people.
Do you feel it could be somebody local?
Well, from what appears to have happened, I suppose it could well be. I wouldn't say it was, but that feeling runs, I suppose.
Does that make it worse, do you think?
Oh, yes.
Years ago, they used to be able to run about the village and you knew they were quite safe, but now it's got so bad that we're frightened to let them out of sight.
As the police and media descended on this small village once more, the residents were all asking the same questions. Who had killed these two girls? And had that person also murdered Yolande Waddington? And was the killer one of their own?
A lot of people said that if he was accused, they couldn't accept it, that he'd have murdered anybody.
On the 17th of April 1967, the bodies of Janette Wigmore and Jacqueline Williams were found here on the outskirts of the small village of Beam in Berkshire. Their murders occurred barely 6 months after this community had been rocked by the discovery of another victim, 17-year-old Yolande Waddington, who'd been similarly stabbed, strangled and dumped in a ditch around a mile away.
There was a view, because of the location, because of the area, this was a rural setting, that it was potentially somebody within the village or local who committed that horrendous crime. I think they narrowed it down, and certainly Wally Virgo narrowed it down to about 14 at the time, who all had alibis. Reduced it down to a further 4, again with alibis.
3 unsolved murders in the tiny village of Beam near Reading meant a possible serial killer was on the loose. Not only that, but the killer was inevitably starting to look as though they were one of the community's own. As the suspects started to decrease in number, 2 names emerged as people of interest.
Suspect-wise, Burgess was always a very, very, very strong suspect.
He and his brother and another man who still lives in the village now, they were working in the gravel pit. I don't know what they were doing because the gravel pits were really closed.
The interviews conducted by the police yielded the names of 2 brothers, John and David Burgess, who worked at the gravel pits where the bodies of Janette and Jacqueline were found.
A number of statements actually contradicted, and there was also evidence presented that actually highlighted just how Burgess was just such a nasty character. He'd walk around with a large knife, intimidate people. It became very clear that this man was, well, frankly, a nasty piece of work. The evidence that we were presented with, and at the time, the SIO clearly had a view that Burgess had something to do with it.
As part of the investigation, David Burgess was asked to hand over the clothes he'd been wearing on the 17th of April 1967 to the police. In doing this, he went from being a person of interest to prime suspect.
He was 20, and I mean, he'd lived in the village for that 20 years, but he'd never been questioned about anything as nearly as seriously as that. Word do go round that David Burgess didn't meet with the best people, if you know what I mean. But a lot of people said that if he was accused, they couldn't accept it. He wouldn't be guilty, especially one woman. She lived at Aubrey Farm, and after work she used to pop down to the Six Bells for, I think, a little tipple. He took her home every night because there was danger, and she believed him, and she said she felt as safe as houses with him. So there were some that just couldn't take it in that he'd have murdered anybody.
There were statements that clearly placed Burgess at the scene. There was a knife that had been identified as well because the young girls had got some knife wounds. His argument for the knife was that he'd lost it a few weeks before, so he actually recognised that, yes, that was his knife. So there was that evidence, and then there was evidence of blood on his boot, which again matched the blood at the scene. So in this instance, there was enough evidence to put him into court. Vigorously denied it, and in fact continued to deny it.
David Burgess was primarily psychopathic. He was somebody who was always thought of as a troublemaker by locals. He was difficult to get to know, according to a schoolgirl friend. He was somebody who was probably ready to impose his will on other people to get whatever he wanted. He was never completely on the right side of the law. And when he had his opportunity, he proved himself a very straightforward killer.
Blood had been found on David Burgess's right boot that matched Janette Wigmore's rare blood group. His brother, John Burgess, had also given a statement that placed David at the scene of the crime on the date that Janette and Jacqueline had been murdered. It was enough for the police to make their move, and on the 7th of May, 1967, David Burgess was charged with the murder of Janette Wigmore. 18 days later, on the 25th of May, he was also charged with the murder of Jacqueline Williams.
We took Burgess up to Oxford Prison on remand. I was driving the vehicle. Burgess sat in the back, and all the time he was as if nothing had happened, whatever, you know. He was just bubbling forwards, rattling on it, everything. Nothing to do with the case. Total idiot. No guilt about him at all. No remorse. He was total creature. Unbelievable.
Although Burgess seemed happy to talk to the police, there was one thing he wouldn't discuss.
Burgess, when interviewed, categorically always denied any involvement in the murder of those two children. And yet there is no doubt the wealth of evidence that was presented at the time of the trial confirms categorically that he killed those two young girls.
It is a primary kind of thing about psychopaths in that they will never, ever reveal information they don't have to. It basically means it's a poker game for them. They have something that you want, their confession, to clear up a crime. They will not give you it unless you actually coalesce to probably ridiculous demands. During David Burgess's trial, there is absolutely no evidence that he felt any remorse whatsoever. In fact, descriptions of him in court were of someone who was bored by the proceedings, who really didn't show any emotion whatsoever, no matter how graphic the detail.
Burgess wouldn't speak about his crimes and seemed almost unaffected by the horrific acts he'd allegedly carried out.
The only word that Burgess spoke in court was no when he was asked by the clerk if he objected to being remanded in custody until Friday, and I'd like legal aid, which was granted to him. When he was taken from the prefabricated court building into the main building, he left as he had arrived in a dark blue police van with dirty windows, his head still covered with a blanket.
When he was convicted of the murders, he was re-interviewed in relation to Yolande's murder. And he was also interviewed about other crimes, including a robbery. And he categorically again denied any involvement in Yolande's murder. He did admit some criminal matters, but when it came to murder, categorically not. There was a huge degree of speculation that there was a link. But even though you've got that speculation and the thoroughness of that investigation, just because he committed this horrendous double child killing, there was still not the tangible evidence to charge him with the murder of Yolande.
Burgess refused to talk to the police about Yolande's murder, but when amongst his peers, he was much more forthcoming.
Why would David Burgess, confess to prison officers or fellow inmates? It may have been that that's his community, that is where he lives. He wants the respect. He wants the respect of being a multiple killer amongst others, because that would be the hierarchy in prison, wouldn't it, really? How much you've done. So within that community, he wanted that disseminated. But outside of that community, he didn't want anybody to know.
Whether he was playing games or not, I think he was still hell-bent on insisting that he'd been set up and framed as a consequence of the inability of the police to charge him with the murder of Yolande. Inferred that actually, he'd already got away with it, but the police couldn't prove that, so they attacked him for this.
He said, you got it, you prove it. When the police interviewed him saying, oh, you said to the prison officer that you killed him, he said, you prove it. So you were back to square one. How do you prove it? Apart from him saying he killed her. And he ain't going to repeat that.
David Burgess may have been safely behind bars, but his refusal to admit to the murder of Yolande Waddington would continue to haunt her family. That was until 40 years later, when in 2007, the Thames Valley Police set up their major crime review team.
Advances in technology, advances in forensic science, advances in expertise. And certainly when it comes to offenders, it puts them on guard and lets them know that actually your time might be coming up.
In 1967, David Burgess was found guilty of the murders of Janette Wigmore and Jacqueline Williams here in the village of Beam.
He was also the prime suspect in the murder of Yolande Waddington, who'd been killed in the same village the previous year.
For over 40 years, Yolande's murder had remained unsolved. Then in 2010, the Thames Valley Major Crime Review Team reopened the case, searching for justice once more.
There's no question that the team, as we reviewed the case, there was a huge amount of circumstantial evidence that linked Burgess to the murder. All we now needed was some potentially scientific evidence that would actually nail him as being Yolande's killer.
We did all we could with the evidence as it was then. If it had been negligence or something, then they would have been extremely annoyed, I think. But the fact was, we exhausted virtually every avenue that was possible in the investigation world.
There are several reasons why the review team was important. One, because there was on file a number of undetected serious offences. It's interesting when police officers deal with a victim and they say, we've not been able to solve this crime, but the crime will always remain open. Now, when you say something like that, certainly as a police officer, you want to say that with integrity, and you certainly don't want to be disingenuous. Advances in technology, advances in forensic science, advances in expertise and training, even from a police officer's perspective. So there was a whole series of things really that was crying out for these crimes to be reinvestigated. From a force perspective, these are also very important because Public confidence in policing is always under scrutiny, never more so now than ever, really. So public confidence is something that's really important because, of course, if you lose that confidence, then you start to have the fear of crime, and that in itself is just as bad. So when you started to reinvestigate these offences and you were able to identify offenders, bring people to justice, that boosted public confidence because it showed people that the police never give up. And that's really important when it comes to victims, and certainly when it comes to offenders, it puts them on guard and lets them know that actually your time might be coming up. There was a number of pieces of clothing, and also we had the fertiliser bag. And the other thing that was quite interesting, that was the key piece of evidence, I still remember now vividly looking at the forensic report. It said description, headband, and then it said underneath grubby. That headband, as grubby as it was actually the strongest piece of evidence against Burgess.
Detailed analysis of the evidence revealed traces of DNA on Yolande's headband, as well as on a polythene fertiliser sack and a comb found at the scene. The DNA was a match to David Burgess.
Blood was found on the headband, which matched categorically, without debate, Burgess as being the killer. Burgess was presented under prison guard to us from Nottingham prison, and all the evidence was put to him. What was his reply? Categorically, I did not do this murder. So yet again, despite everything, he made his position very clear. He denied the admission that he'd made in prison. So bearing in mind he'd been interviewed now several times about this, he continued to deny the offence.
Despite the evidence against him, David Burgess once again refused to confess to Yolande's murder. However, he was finally charged with the crime on the 5th of November, 2011.
Killers behave in very, very strange ways, but there's a killer that actually almost believes their own lies because they've said it that much. And so their arrogance, their defiance, their ability with conviction, ironically, to say that I haven't done this, no, that's not surprising. And we've seen that many times. We've also seen killers with remorse. But in this particular case, with this particular individual, cold, calculating, deviant killer.
David Burgess showed no sense of remorse at all. He was almost intentionally trying to show the jury he didn't care. He was checking his watch, he was polishing his glasses. Giles, Yolande's brother, was in the court for the sentencing as well as the trial. You could tell it was a very emotional experience for him at the time.
I was certainly attending the trial. The trial was covered by the police, all our exhibits officers, our family liaison officers, my deputy SIO. The police presence was immense during the entire trial, and I was obviously kept fully updated.
In July 2012, following a 5-week trial, the jury were ready to give their verdict. And it was hoped that they would finally end a 46-year-old mystery that had haunted Yolande's family and this small Berkshire village.
The jury considered the verdict for a total of 5 days. They reached an 11-1 majority verdict in the end. Burgess was convicted of murder. Giles, the only surviving member that was able to see justice done, unfortunately, he was heard giving just one gasp of relief, really. It was, you could tell it was very emotional for him.
The relief felt in court was shared by the people of Beam, who'd been haunted by this unsolved murder for nearly half a century.
When you know the truth and you know the actual facts and who's been found guilty and they've been put away, that's a great relief in many ways. I was pleased that he'd been punished because at least it gave some relief to their parents. And our little village does remember those girls. In our churchyard, where they're buried, there are 2 cherry trees planted on the gravel path leading up to the west door, and they're for the 2 girls.
I don't think, in all honesty, communities ever recover completely from these things. It'd almost be disingenuous for me to say that, yeah, people, just settle back down, because they don't. And fear of crime actually is more impactful than actually the crime itself. So I don't think you ever recover. But communities have a much greater elderly population now. And sadly, it's that community that we need to protect even more. If you are a surviving family victim and you've lost your loved one, and we, the police, have not yet brought that killer to justice, you would be hoping that there's a review team looking over your case. That's why major crime review teams up and down the country are so important.
To have one murder take place in such a small village was shocking back in the 1960s, but to have 3 was almost unheard of.
David Burgess was always the prime suspect in Yolande Waddington's murder, and thanks to the hard work of a small group of officers, he was finally brought to justice over 4 decades later.
Despite the case being closed, the shadow of Burgess's actions still hangs over this tiny community, and it always will.